Book 4, Chapter 8. In one of those islands, whose history the imperishable literature and renown of Athens yet invest with melancholy interest, and on which nature, in whom there is nothing melancholy, still bestows a glory of scenery and climate equally radiant for the free man or the slave, the Ionian, the Venetian, the Gaul, the Turk, or the restless Briton, Zanoni had fixed his bridal home. There the air carries with it the perfumes of the plains for miles along the blue, translucent deep. Seen from one of its green sloping heights, the island he had selected seemed one delicious garden. The towers and turrets of its capital gleaming amidst groves of oranges and lemons, vineyards and olive woods filling up the valleys and clambering along the hillsides, and villa, farm, and cottage covered with luxuriant trellises of dark green leaves and purple fruit. For there the prodigal beauty yet seems half to justify those graceful superstitions of a creed that, too enamored of earth, rather brought the deities to man than raised the man to their less alluring and less voluptuous Olympus. Durch die Schöpfung floss der Lebensfülle, an der Liebe Rusen sie zu drücken, gab man Herren Adel der Katur. And still to the fishermen, weaving yet their antique dances on the sand, to the maiden, adoring yet with many a silver fibula her glossy tresses under the tree that overshadows her tranquil cot, the same great mother that watched over the wise of Samos, the democracy of Corcyra, the graceful and deep-taught loveliness of Miletos, smiles as graciously as of yore. For the North, philosophy and freedom are essentials to human happiness. In the lands which Aphrodite rose from the waves to govern, as the seasons, hand in hand, stood to welcome her on the shores, nature is all sufficient. The isle which Zanoni had selected was one of the loveliest in that divine sea. His abode, at some distance from the city, but near one of the creeks on the shore, belonged to a Venetian, and, though small, had more of elegance than the natives ordinarily cared for. On the seas and in sight rode his vessel. His Indians, as before, ministered in mute gravity to the service of the household. No spot could be more beautiful, no solitude less invaded. To the mysterious knowledge of Zanoni, to the harmless ignorance of Viola, the babbling and garish world of civilized man was alike unheeded. The loving sky and the lovely earth are companions enough to wisdom and to ignorance while they love. Although, as I have said before, there was nothing in the visible occupations of Zanoni that betrayed a cultivator of the occult sciences, his habits were those of a man who remembers or reflects. He loved to roam alone, chiefly at dawn or at night when the moon was clear, especially in each month at its rise and full, miles and miles away over the rich inlands of the island, and to cull herbs and flowers, which he hoarded with jealous care. Sometimes, at the dead of night, Viola would awake by an instinct that told her he was not by her side, and, stretching out her arms, find that the instinct had not deceived her. But she early saw that he was reserved on his peculiar habits, and if at times a chill, a foreboding, a suspicious awe crept over her, she forbore to question him. But his rambles were not always unaccompanied. He took pleasure in excursions less solitary. Often, when the sea lay before them like a lake, the barren dreariness of the opposite coast of Cephallenius, contrasting the smiling shores on which they dwelt, Viola and himself would pass days in cruising slowly around the coast, or in visits to the neighboring isles. Every spot of the Greek soil, that fair fable land, seemed to him familiar, and as he conversed of the past and its exquisite traditions, he taught Viola to love the race from which have descended the poetry and the wisdom of the world. There was much in Zanoni, as she knew him better, that deepened the fascination in which Viola was from the first enthralled. His love for herself was so tender, so vigilant, and had that best and most enduring attribute, that it seemed rather grateful for the happiness in its own cares than vain of the happiness it created. His habitual mood with all who approached him was calm and gentle, almost to apathy. An angry word never passed his lips, an angry gleam never shot from his eyes. Once they had been exposed to the danger not uncommon in those then half-savage lands. Some pirates who infested the neighboring coasts had heard of the arrival of the strangers, and the seamen Zanoni employed had gossiped of their master's wealth. One night, after Viola had retired to rest, she was awakened by a slight noise below. Zanoni was not by her side. She listened in some alarm. Was that a groan that came upon her ear? She started up. She went to the door. All was still. A footstep now slowly approached, and Zanoni entered calm as usual, and seemed unconscious of her fears. The next morning 3 men were found dead at the threshold of the principal entrance, the door of which had been forced. They were recognized in the neighborhood as the most sanguinary and terrible marauders of the coasts, men stained with 1,000 murders, and who had never hitherto failed in any attempt to which the lust of rapine had impelled them. The footsteps of many others were tracked to the seashore. It seemed that their accomplices must have fled on the death of their leaders. But when the Venetian proveditore, or authority, of the island came to examine into the matter, the most unaccountable mystery was the manner in which these ruffians had met their fate. Zanoni had not stirred from the apartment in which he ordinarily pursued his chemical studies. None of the servants had even been disturbed from their slumbers. No marks of human violence were on the bodies of the dead. They died and made no sign. From that moment Zanoni's house, nay, the whole vicinity, was sacred. The neighboring villages, rejoiced to be delivered from a scourge, regarded the stranger as one whom the Pagiana, or Virgin, held under her especial protection. In truth, the lively Greeks around, facile to all external impressions, and struck with the singular and majestic beauty of the man who knew their language as a native, whose voice often cheered them in their humble sorrows, and whose hand was never closed to their wants, long after he had left their shore, preserved his memory by grateful traditions, and still point to the lofty platanus beneath which they had often seen him seated, alone and thoughtful, in the heats of noon. But Zanoni had haunts less open to the gaze than the shade of the platanus. In that isle there are the bituminous springs, which Herodotus has commemorated. Often at night, the moon, at least, beheld him emerging from the myrtle and cistus that clothe the hillocks around the marsh that embeds the pools containing the inflammable materia, all the medical uses of which, as applied to the nerves of organic life, modern science has not yet perhaps explored. Yet more often would he pass his hours in a cavern by the loneliest part of the beach, where the stalactites seem almost arranged by the hand of art, and which the superstition of the peasants associates, in some ancient legends, with the numerous and almost incessant earthquakes to which the island is so singularly subjected. Whatever the pursuits that instigated these wanderings and favored these haunts, either they were linked with, or else subordinate to, one main and master desire, which every fresh day passed in the sweet human company of Viola confirmed and strengthened. The scene that Glyndon had witnessed in his trance was faithful to truth, and some little time after the date of that night, Viola was dimly aware that an influence, she knew not of what nature, was struggling to establish itself over her happy life. Visions indistinct and beautiful, such as those she had known in her earlier days, but more constant and impressive, began to haunt her night and day when Zanoni was absent, to fade in his presence, and seem less fair than that. Zanoni questioned her eagerly and minutely of these visitations, but seemed dissatisfied and at times perplexed by her answers. "Tell me not," he said one day, "of those unconnected images, those evolutions of starry shapes in a choral dance, or those delicious melodies that seem to thee of the music and the language of the distant spheres. Has no one shape been to thee more distinct and more beautiful than the rest? No voice, uttering or seeming to utter thine own tongue, and whispering to thee of strange secrets and solemn knowledge?" "No, all is confused in these dreams, whether of day or night, and when, at the sound of thy footsteps, I recover, my memory retains nothing but a vague impression of happiness. How different, how cold, to the rapture of hanging on thy smile, and listening to thy voice when it says, 'I love thee.'" Yet how is it that visions less fair than these once seemed to thee so alluring? How is it that they then stirred thy fancies and filled thy heart? Once thou didst desire a fairyland, and now thou seemst so contented with common life. "Have I not explained it to thee before? Is it common life, then, to love, and to live with the one we love? My true fairyland is one. Speak to me of no other." And so night surprised them by the lonely beach, and Zanoni, allured from his sublimer projects, and bending over that tender face, forgot that, in the harmonious infinite which spread around, there were other worlds than that one human